All right, we're gonna go ahead and get a start here. Good afternoon. This is our speaker series for the African American Historical Association of Western Maryland. I'm Richard Klein, president, and today, we're happy to present Cooper Wingert, who will be speaking to us about Abolitionists of South Central PA, which is his most recent book, and this is number 8, I believe, is what we're talking about. So, you know, I don't know how you do it because I'm just amazed how prolific you are at writing. So and your books are extremely well researched. So they're a pleasure to read. So again, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Wingert, and I'm going to go ahead and make you host then, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thank you, Rick. And I'm going to share my screen.
All right.
So let's.
Okay, great.
Can everyone see all right? Thumbs up if you can see. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today about my book, Slavery and the Underground Railroad in South Central Pennsylvania. And this book came out 5 years ago, and it's divided in half, and I'm also going to divide this presentation in half. I initially set out to write a book about the Underground Railroad. But as I was researching it, I started to discover that the history of the Underground Railroad and the anti-slavery movement was really inseparable from the history of slavery in Pennsylvania in the years in the colonial era and the Revolutionary era and the early 1800s. So the book itself is divided into 2 sections, the first talking about slavery in Pennsylvania and the North, and the second on the Underground Railroad and the coming of the Civil War. And that's how I've also divided this program. So just to set the geographic parameters for what I'm discussing, I talk about a region that is often known as South Central Pennsylvania. And this is a map of kind of the existing cities and towns that were in the region around 1800. Now, the county lines changed a lot over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to refer to locations in their modern day county boundaries. But just to give you kind of the scope of the 4 counties that we'll be talking about today. The first is York County, which in 1749 was carved out from the Susquehanna River all the way to the South Mountain. Basically what we know today is modern day York and Adams counties. In 1800, Adams County is carved out of that. The other county we're talking about is Cumberland County. And when this was created in 1750, it was gargantuan. It was basically everything west of the Susquehanna River. So there are a number of counties today that have been carved out of it, but for today's purposes, we're just going to be focusing on the Cumberland Valley. So the area you see in the map between the Blue Mountains and the South Mountain Range. And the second county carved out of this is Franklin County, which is carved out in 1784. So now that we've set the geographical stage, we'll go into the history of slavery. So slavery often surprises people that slavery existed in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania is known as the Quaker colony, and Quakers are known for their anti-slavery credentials. But in fact, the Quakers in the Americas did not ban slaveholding among their own members until 1774. And Pennsylvania, as most of you probably know, was founded in the 1680s. So for the first 90 odd years of Pennsylvania's existence, not only is slavery legal among the Quakers, but Quakers are among the leading slaveholders because they're also among the wealthiest and biggest landholding citizens in early Pennsylvania. There are some crucial differences between what slavery looks like in a place like Pennsylvania and what it looks like in the southern colonies that we kind of have as our stereotypical view of slavery. So in the southern colonies, there are staple crops. At the time in Maryland and Virginia, there's tobacco. And in South Carolina, there's indigo and rice. Cotton doesn't come along until about 1800. But that means you're going to have big plantations with dozens and sometimes even hundreds of enslaved people owned by one single slaveholder. You don't have that in the northern colonies because there's no staple crop to support that type of intensive agriculture. Instead, the average slaveholder in the North owns about 1 or 2 enslaved people. Now, it's tempting to think that this suggests that slavery in the North was somehow less oppressive or milder, But in fact, it oftentimes created more opportunities for exploitation and abuse because most enslaved people lived under the same roofs as their enslavers. So it's important, even though it looks different, slavery is still slavery in Pennsylvania and throughout the rest of the northern colonies. So to give you a little glimpse of what slavery looks like in the Cumberland Valley, slavery exists in Pennsylvania from the get-go when Quakers first found Philadelphia in 1680s. William Penn owns enslaved people. Slavery doesn't really spread into the Cumberland Valley until about the 1750s, and that's when white settlers continue to encroach westward onto Indian land. And you see a couple of wealthy slaveholders move into the area with their enslaved people. And again, these are wealthy by Pennsylvania standards, and that, like, Philip Davis here holds 7 enslaved people. But in a place like Virginia, he would have been a poor slaveholder because the average slaveholder owned about 22 people. And then you have someone like Henry Pauling, another wealthy slaveholder who lived near what is now Greencastle. He owned upwards of 700 acres, and he enslaved 8 people. And we can deduce from the estate inventory that is left by Pauling that the enslaved people he held probably lived in a small space above his kitchen. And this is a common feature in Northern slavery, that oftentimes enslaved people not only live under the same roof, but they usually have a small space, a small living space under or just above the kitchen. And this is one of the reasons why I like to lead with the story of slavery in Pennsylvania before we get into the Underground Railroad, because of the two, we know a lot more about the Underground Railroad than we do about slavery in Pennsylvania. And oftentimes we mix the two up. So a good example is, has anyone ever been to the Dobbin House in Gettysburg? It's a restaurant, a very popular restaurant in Gettysburg, and they advertise, it was built in 1776, the original building, it's been expanded on. But they advertised the space above the historic 1776 kitchen as a kind of underground railroad hiding spot. Now, in fact, when the building was built in the 1770s, the building owner, Alexander Dobbin, held enslaved people. And it was his son who went broke and then moved to another county, who then became an abolitionist. So there's some truth to the story, but in all likelihood, this space that has been labeled a kind of an underground railroad hiding spot perhaps may have actually had more to do with Pennsylvania slavery than the Underground Railroad, which is why I think it's important to start the story with the history of slavery. And like I said, just because slavery in Pennsylvania looks different doesn't mean it's any different. This is a runaway advertisement from Carlisle in the 1780s. And enslaved people resisted just as they did throughout the South. And their slaveholders tried to re-enslave them and fought back. So again, it may not look like the South, and it may not look like what we're traditionally used to associating with slavery, but there are a lot of conflicts that go on. So 1780, we have this map here with some incredibly detailed information about the names and the numbers of enslaved people who lived in what was then Cumberland County, what is now the 2 counties of Cumberland and Franklin. So how do we get all this information? Because slaveholders didn't really write about enslaved people except when they were buying and selling them. And enslaved people were prohibited from writing and reading. A few of them learn how to read and write, but legally they're not allowed to. So the reason we know all this information is because in the midst of the Revolutionary War, Pennsylvania abolishes slavery. But, this is a big but, they do it gradually. So the Revolutionary War is a time of big change, and 3 of the northern colonies during the war, not after, but during the war, abolish slavery. But they do it in very different ways that have very different outcomes. So Vermont is the first. Vermont abolishes slavery when it adopts its constitution in 1777. So they're the first to to abolish slavery. The second state 3 years later is Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania passes through the legislature a bill for the gradual emancipation of slavery. Now, the third state is Massachusetts, and Massachusetts, an enslaved woman named Bet Freeman sues for her freedom. She wins, and the judge rules that slavery is illegal, and it's instantly abolished by judicial action. So you have by constitution, by legislation, and by judicial action. Pennsylvania is the legislative action, and it is gradual. And because unlike Vermont that does it by constitution, Massachusetts does it by judicial action, Pennsylvania is the longest and most drawn out process of emancipation. Massachusetts, it's instant. Vermont, it's fairly quick. In Pennsylvania, it goes on almost to the outbreak of the Civil War. Emancipation drags out that long. Because what the law does is it still prioritizes the property rights of slaveholders over the freedom of enslaved people. And what it says is that anyone who was born before March 1st, 1780, that's the day the law is passed, is a slave for life. There's no light at the end of the tunnel for them. So everybody you see on this map, represented on this map, will remain enslaved for life. But those born after March 1st, 1780, they'll become free when they turn 28. So in theory, the law won't free a single person until 1808, which is very, very slow. And it's a very, in some ways the law is revolutionary, but it also leaves a lot of people behind. So I think, some earlier historians just celebrated the law, but I think it's important to bear in mind that there's some big shortcomings to it. So how do we have all this information? Well, if you're in the 18th century, in the era before birth certificates, and you're a government trying to enforce a law that's based on age, that determines a person's freedom or their status on age, you have to keep track of births. And what they do is they create a slave registry, and they say, if you are a slaveholder and you want to continue to enslave people, you have to go to your county courthouse and register them, their date of birth, and then that will map out 28 years from then when they will be free. So slaveholders all across have to ride a day or 2 days to their county courthouses to actively register enslaved people, which again shows how tightly they're holding on. And this is the kind of document that we can build that gives us some insight into the lives of people who were enslaved in Pennsylvania. This is a slave registration. This is a slaveholder named Samuel McCoon in Hopewell Township, which is near Shippensburg in Cumberland County. And you can see here, he is going to the county courthouse and he's registering these enslaved people, all of whom will remain enslaved for life under the 1780 law. So again, Paul, Luce, Peter, Patty, Sal, Isabel, they are all left behind by this law. So York County and what is now Adams County, we have some information, but it's incomplete. We don't have the slave registry that survives for Cumberland County. Who knows, maybe it's in somebody's attic, but no historian has yet found the slave registry for York County. But we do have some incomplete tax records. So our data about York County and slaveholding is incomplete, but what we can say is that the majority of enslaved people are concentrated in what is now the southwestern corner of Adams County. So if you see where Cumberland, Strabane, Hamilton Van are, that's near where Gettysburg is today. So as I said, slaveholders don't take this lying down. And part of the reason why the Gradual Emancipation Act managed to pass the Pennsylvania Assembly is because it was, the Assembly was then meeting in Philadelphia, and in Eastern Pennsylvania, slavery was on the decline by this point. The Quakers had come out against slavery in 1774. Quakers had a big influence in Eastern Pennsylvania, and the shift from slave labor to indentured servants or free labor was already taking place, but not so much in South Central Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of opposition. And just to give you an idea of some of the, how we can get at some of this is certain slaveholders, when they're filing their registrations, scrawled nasty messages on the back of these legal documents to register their protest. It's kind of like the Facebook comment section of the 1780s, where here's George Stevenson, a Carlisle slaveholder. He calls it a useless act of the General Assembly. I hope he's talking about the clerk, will be paid $6, which is the only good thing in the act, for it will help to pay his tax. A slaveholder from Shippensburg, Francis Campbell, bemoans the law is attended with some difficulties. Law is attended with some difficulties which are so surprising. The gentlemen who esteem themselves men of sense and wish to be in high reputation with their neighbors should spend time and load the inhabitants with frivolous expenses in making such frivolous laws as respect the matter in hand. So for Stevenson or Campbell, it is a useless act or a frivolous law. something that is an annoyance, but certainly for enslaved people, it is a incomplete but ultimately vital path to ultimate freedom. Now, flash forward 30 years. This is Cumberland County with its modern boundaries by then in 1810. And you'll notice the number of enslaved people has actually ticked up marginally. And slavery, at this point, 40% of all enslaved people in Pennsylvania are within Cumberland County. In these 4 counties we've talked about, 60% of all enslaved people live within these 4 counties: Cumberland, Franklin, York, and Adams in Pennsylvania. It's a testament partly to geography. The Susquehanna River is not bridged until the War of 1812. So a lot of farmers and slaveholders formed connections to the south in Hagerstown and in Maryland and Virginia, more so than they do to the east in Lancaster and counties to the east. The other important factor to take away from this, and again, 1810, you can do the math. It's 30 years from the gradual emancipation law. Remember, people are free when they turn 28. So each year in the 18 teens, you have a new generation of so-called term slaves who are turning 28 and they're gaining their freedom. So by the 1820s, slavery is very much on the decline, but it doesn't fully die out. There are still slaves in Cumberland County in the 1840s, all the way up to within 10 years of the Civil War. So it lasts long. But importantly, it provides a really crucial foundation for the Underground Railroad, because there are large communities of African Americans who are living in this region of Pennsylvania. Many of them have come up, they're only a generation away from slavery themselves. They fought slavery in the courts. They've had to go to court to sue masters who violated the gradual emancipation law, to sue for the freedom of their family members, their brothers, their sisters, their fathers and mothers. So they have a tradition of activism in many ways that is homegrown in Pennsylvania. That's going to be crucial when we talk about the development of the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad, there's few subjects in American history that are this cloaked in myth. And I think a lot of people have this impression that the Underground Railroad is kind of, maybe it existed, but it's more of this mythical legend and lore, and it's not exactly what doesn't hold up under scrutiny per se. And I'll just go through kind of the history of how historians have dealt with this subject, just to give you a background about kind of changing views, and then explain to you kind of where we're at now. The first histories of the Underground Railroad were written in the 1890s. And this is still when there was the Civil War generation and pre-Civil War generation, many members were still alive. And Siebert was a historian at Ohio State University, and he went around and got recollections and accounts from abolitionists and their sons and daughters. And he constructed this, very romanticized portrait of the Underground Railroad, and he claimed it was the centrally organized institution that was constantly helping freedom seekers escape into the North. The thing about Siebert is that he had a point and he wanted to prove it. So he was willing to accept evidence at face value. He also had a very implicit bias against African Americans, remarkably for an Underground Railroad historian. So he identified 3,200 conductors throughout the nation as part of the Underground Railroad. 6 of them were African Americans. Now, I can name 6 African American abolitionists in Carlisle alone. So the idea that there's only 6 in the entire nation is a farce, but it gives you an idea of the flaws of Siebert's work. Well, in the 1960s, a whole new generation of historians basically just said Siebert was making this up, that he was too gullible. He fell for all these fantastical stories, and essentially he didn't know what he was talking about. And I think historians have started to strike a balance between that. We're realizing now that the Underground Railroad was not such a secretive organization, but it also wasn't entirely fabricated as Siebert implied in his work, that it in many ways was a public campaign. And I think what we're arriving at now is this view that the Underground Railroad is both a political and a legal campaign to end slavery that did much of its work in the public eye, and that's really important to remember. So I want to bring up the concept of the vigilance committees, which are really the backbone of the Underground Railroad. And you might not have heard this term before, vigilance committee, but vigilance had a particular meaning in the 19th century. Today, its root word was the word vigilante. And if you, vigilante has a negative connotation today. I certainly wouldn't go around calling myself a vigilante. But in the 19th century, it had a different meaning. And that was rooted in this idea of self-protection, or kind of a community or neighborhood watch. So the most famous example is during the California Gold Rush, when there's all of these mining settlements cropping up so fast that they can't form local governments, that vigilance committees, they form vigilance committees basically to kind of form a self-policing organization. So people aren't running amok, stealing each other's gold and killing each other. And anti-slavery activists in the antebellum North adopt the same idea. And this photograph at the right, this is a photograph of the executive committee of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, which you can see they're biracial. They're usually led by African Americans. Most of their membership, usually about 90% African American. And vigilance committees operate on two different tracks. One is public. And they form what scholars are now calling the first civil rights movement, really kicking off in the 1820s and all the way to the Civil War, which is that they're petitioning legislatures, they're arguing for basic rights. We're not talking about voting rights, we're talking about the right to protect oneself, the right to due process, so that the idea that a slaveholder can't just come north and pick somebody up and say that they're his slave and then return with them to the South. Which again, they seem modest, but they are important in the long run. The second track they do is they also do illegal activity, which is probably what you were expecting when you came to a talk on the Underground Railroad, was the illegal stuff. And they break the law a lot. And usually it is if they can't get the reforms in the legal process that they want, they will break the law. They'll either aid freedom seekers who come north, or they will help orchestrate rescues when freedom seekers are recaptured and brought before authorities. So to give you an idea of what these vigilance committees look like in South Central PA, one of the earliest is formed in Gettysburg at the AME Church. This one is entirely filled by African Americans. And this is a public newspaper. They aren't concealing this. This is in public. Their mission statement: we feel it our indispensable duty to assist such of our brethren as shall come among us for the purpose of liberating themselves, and to raise all the means in our power to give effect to our object, which is to give liberty to our brethren groaning under the tyrannical yoke of oppression. So they're saying it quite boldly. Not only are we going to petition for our rights before the state, but we're also going to break the law when push comes to shove and aid runaways who come into Gettysburg. Another similar group forms in the mid-1850s in Harrisburg, the Fugitive Aid Society. And give you an idea, it's led by Black activists, and sometimes they purchase actual railroad tickets to help send freedom seekers from Harrisburg to Philadelphia. At that time, there's rail lines, and as railroads are spreading throughout the North, they're actually aiding slave flight, because it's a lot easier to get from one place to another fast along an actual railroad. So the Underground Railroad is a metaphor, but oftentimes freedom seekers actually do use literal railroads. Frederick Douglass, when he escaped from slavery in the 1830s, he took a train from Baltimore to Philadelphia, and then from Philadelphia to New York. And this was relatively an open secret. As you can see from the newspaper clipping on the right, this is from a Harrisburg newspaper in 1859 that proclaims the Underground Railroad continues to do a large business. Last night, 3 more fugitives from labor arrived from Maryland, were entertained for a few hours by the self-appointed agents of the Underground Railroad, and before daylight resumed their journey northward. This is a legal activity, and they're reporting on it nonchalantly in a local newspaper. It's not an abolitionist newspaper, by the way. This is just a local Harrisburg paper. And one of the reasons is that in the North, with this kind of what we call the first civil rights movement, the laws in the northern states are very lenient towards abolitionists. So abolitionists had very little to fear for breaking the law. In the 20 years before the Civil War, the harshest punishment to an abolitionist was about 6 months in prison. Whereas by contrast, slave catchers were routinely sentenced to several years in prison. Now, abolitionists in the South under Southern state laws were really in trouble. They might get as much as 20 years in prison, but as long as they're in the North and they're breaking the law in northern states, abolitionists were on pretty firm ground, and they didn't have too much to worry about, which is why the Underground Railroad was this kind of quasi-public institution. So this is a map of the Underground Railroad, what are called routes. I don't particularly like the term routes because they change so often and fluctuated, but this gives you a general sense of kind of the paths to freedom through the area taken by freedom seekers. I am going to touch on one kind of other vigilance hub, which is in northern Adams County, and I can't point because I'm over Zoom, but if you look at the word Adams for Adams County and look just to the north, that is this little strip of northern Adams County where there were a lot of Quaker vigilance operatives. Excuse me one second, I'm trying to admit somebody. All right, so Quaker Valley. Quaker Valley becomes kind of a vigilance hub starting in the 1820s, and which is pretty early for the vigilance movement. And we actually have an eyewitness account from a freedom seeker who traveled through Adams County and linked up with these group of abolitionists in northern Adams County, and his name is James Pennington. He's pictured at the right. He escapes from Hagerstown, Maryland in November 1828. He travels northward. And to give you an idea, this is pretty typical. He doesn't get any help until he gets into Pennsylvania. He's pretty much on his own for the first leg of the journey. And Pennington struggles. He nears the Mason-Dixon line, where there are a lot of bands of slave catchers roaming the border, looking for people, vulnerable folks like James Pennington, to try to capture and re-enslave, and they pick him up. And Pennington is within an earshot. He can hear them in another room debating, should they wait for a runaway ad to be posted for his reward, or should they sell him to the Baltimore market and try to make more money? And he'll never be heard of. He'll be sent to some, sugar plantation in Louisiana, and that's where he'll die a very early and brutal death. Pennington has to think fast, and he has to think on his feet. So when they come back in the room, he tells the slave catchers, "Okay, I fess up. I'm not a free person. I'm actually a slave, but I just came from a group of slaves that had the smallpox." So suddenly the slave catchers don't want to be so close to James Pennington. So they leave the room, and he uses the opportunity to bust out of a back window and continue his escape northward. But still, Pennington's not out of the woods. He's traveling through Adams County. He doesn't know anybody. But finally, he links up about 5 days later to the point where he's at the point of near starvation with two Quakers, William and Phoebe Wright, who live in northern Adams County. And they are, they take Pennington in, they give him a job, do what vigilance forces normally do. They kind of provide shelter, food, employment, and eventually they send him on his way further north. He later becomes a minister, and he is a prominent abolitionist in New York City throughout the 1850s. He even writes a memoir called The Fugitive Blacksmith that is an instant classic among the abolitionist movement, shortly before Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that's a really great firsthand account of escaping along the Underground Railroad in South Central PA. So it's all good and well that we can talk about these little vigilance pockets and the Underground Railroad, but what does it have to do with the coming of the Civil War? And I want to take a cue from Abraham Lincoln, and I'm going to tell a story to illustrate the point. So it's a sweltering summer day in June 1847 in Carlisle at the courthouse, which you can see pictured here, still standing. The courthouse itself has just been completed months earlier, and there's a fugitive slave case unfolding. There's two Maryland slaveholders who have captured three freedom seekers, a man named George Lloyd, a woman named Esther, and her daughter, who's about 8 years old, named Anne. And they drag them up the steps of the courthouse into the courtroom. Now, slaveholders, like these two men from Maryland, they believe that their property rights in slaves are absolute, that just like any other form of property, whether it's a horse or a house, as hard as that, as heartbreaking and cruel as that sounds, they believe that they can go anywhere in the nation and recover runaways. Just because someone crosses state lines, they're still property. So they enter this courtroom expecting that they're going to be their property is going to be returned to them in short order. But what happens within minutes, about 100 African Americans from Carlisle surround the courthouse. Now, this is before Facebook. This is before Facebook Messenger. This is before telephones. How do 100 people within minutes know to surround a courthouse? And I think that testifies to this vigilance network. They have this amazing grapevine or word of mouth method of spreading communication. And they're able to mobilize a large community of activists within minutes. So all of a sudden, this what was supposed to be a pretty quick and simple, matter of recapturing 3 people, all of a sudden has gotten a lot more complicated. And in the meantime, a Dickinson College professor named John McClintock rocks up. And McClintock, in typical professor fashion, goes into the courtroom and tells the judge he doesn't know the law and that he starts correcting the judge, just like any good professor would do. But anyway, McClintock's efforts are all for naught. It just drags out the proceedings. But by this time, a large crowd is gathered outside the courtroom. And as the 2 slaveholders exit the courthouse on the front steps that you can see in that picture there, with the 3 captives in tow, a number of African-American activists rush them, and they manage to free 2 of the 3 captives. The more controversial thing happens is in this melee, there's violence, there's punching, there's swinging of clubs and brickbats, there's knives flaring. One of the slaveholders, a man named Hollingsworth, is trampled to death. And this starts a national firestorm. The idea that a slaveholder, a Southern man going north in pursuit of his property, what he considered his property and what slaveholders considered to be property, was killed in the process. This outraged slaveholders. So this little incident that happens in Carlisle makes it front page news across the East Coast. It's debated in Congress. Leading slaveholders like John Calhoun are irate about this, and they're going off about this to their northern colleagues that this is insensible. So it raises the question about why is the Underground Railroad so important to the coming of the Civil War? Because if you looked at it through mathematics, which I've never been too fond of, the Underground Railroad doesn't really pose much of a threat because on average, about 1,000 to 3,000 people escape per year from the South. Now there are 4 million people enslaved in the South, and the rate of people being born into slavery far outpaces the 1,000 to 3,000 per year who are escaping. So why are slaveholders so worked up? Why do they go to civil war to protect slavery? Well, part of it is that this anti-slavery vigilance movement, the Underground Railroad, is advancing a very different idea about what kind of a country the United States should be. So slaveholders, in their mind, the United States should not be a neutral nation on the question of slavery. It needs to be explicitly pro-slavery. From slaveholders' perspective, the U.S. has to promote slavery in the world. They have to prop up the fledgling slave regimes in Brazil and Cuba. And what this Underground Railroad and the vigilance movement are doing is they are proposing what scholars now call this first civil rights movement, is they're saying, no, in fact, freedom is the norm and slavery is the exception. So that the United States is a nation that is dedicated to protecting civil rights for African Americans, even if that didn't yet include voting rights. And whereas slavery will be the exception that is limited to the Southern states. This is the platform that Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860. Lincoln promises to not admit any new slave states. So eventually, when you admit more free states, the free states will outnumber the slave states, and slavery will eventually be destroyed. Lincoln himself considers this a very slow process. In 1860, when he's elected, he says, maybe we could abolish slavery by 1891. His hope, Lincoln's hope, was that the new century, the 20th century, would not dawn on an American slave. Little did he imagine that he would be helping to usher through the 13th Amendment 5 years later to end slavery, which is a testament to how war can speed things up. That seemed unimaginable, 5 years earlier, that slavery would be abolished. But it's important to remember, if we think about the Underground Railroad less as this kind of secret network of coded quilts and secret signs, and more as an actual civil rights movement, we can understand why slaveholders are so upset about it, and why it drives the coming of the Civil War, because It's advancing a fundamentally different idea about what kind of nation the US should be. And that's really important. So to wrap up, I want to tell a little bit about how the Underground Railroad interacts with another story we're all familiar with, which is the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'm sure everyone here knows the basics of the Battle of Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee invades Pennsylvania. He meets the Union Army under George Meade at Gettysburg, and Meade wins a victory, and the war, you know, the decisive victory, as it's often called, and the tide of the war turns, so on and so forth. But a story that's often submerged in that is this retaliation that slaveholders, Confederate soldiers, wage on the region for its long Underground Railroad history. And when Confederate forces come north, they immediately start rounding up African Americans, both some who they claim are runaways, but many of them who were born in Pennsylvania and were born free. And there's plenty of evidence that the Confederate High Command knew about this. People like Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, they were well aware of this. So and there's plenty of evidence too that I found both in Confederate soldiers' letters and in civilian letters that Confederate soldiers are going door to door in some of these communities asking where the abolitionists are, both because they're trying to find African Americans, but also they want to exact revenge. As Rick knows, when the Confederates get to Caledonia Furnace, which is a property owned by the abolitionist Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, they burn his property. And we have diaries from Confederate soldiers that say, we burned his property because he's a rank abolitionist. So they saw this as a war of revenge. And I want to highlight one very puzzling story from this aspect of the Gettysburg campaign, and that is the story of Amos Barnes. So we don't have a picture of Amos Barnes. We know that he was a free African-American man from Mercersburg in western Franklin County. And when the Confederates come north, he allegedly helps some Confederate cavalry and guides them to the location of runaway slaves. Now, Barnes apparently did this, again, details are hazy, but with the promise that he in return would not himself be enslaved. But promises made by Confederates are often not that good. And in the confusion of such business, as he later writes, he is sent back to Richmond as a prisoner, and he's imprisoned at this place here, not a very nice place, Castle Thunder Prison, along with a couple dozens of other African Americans who were captured during the Gettysburg campaign. So Barnes, he manages to bribe a Confederate soldier to get a letter through, and he writes to this man, Thomas Cray, on the left, who's a minister in Mercersburg, and with the help of his friend, T.V. Moore, who's a minister in Richmond, they managed to lobby the Confederate War Department for his release. But they do so by saying that Barnes should be released not because he's a free person who deserves to be free, but because he helped Confederate forces find other free people to enslave. So the mystery remains here, and this is, again, I perhaps further research will help figure out the exact truth. We don't know whether Barnes was actually a Confederate agent or if he was simply kind of spinning the best story that he thought was most likely to win him his freedom from Confederate authorities. So anyway, I hope that the main takeaway you have from this talk is that we need to start thinking about the Underground Railroad less as kind of this clandestine network and more as the first wave of a broader civil rights movement that really, really forces to the forefront this question of what kind of nation the United States should be. So with that, I'll wrap up and leave some time here for questions and answers if you have any questions.
All right. Well, we have about 8 or 9 people in here, so we're not going to worry about raising hands if you want to just jump in and ask a question. So feel free to do that. Anybody?
So the lawyer in me is curious now. When slaves did sell, you mentioned they would sue their owners when they wouldn't follow Pennsylvania law to slowly end slavery. Were they frequently successful or rarely so?
That's a great question. It was an uphill battle because oftentimes, enslaved people weren't literate, so sometimes they didn't know when there were errors in their registration or when they weren't registered. So in some ways, slaveholders kind of had the upper hand because they could read the documents. A lot of the county officials were favorable. In Eastern Pennsylvania, there was a lot of success because there was this group formed in the 1770s called the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and they were based in Philadelphia. They're still active today, actually. They've focused on different causes now, but the group is still alive. But they sent lawyers out into the countryside in Bucks County and the areas around Philly, and they would essentially check in on slaveholders and make sure that they were following the letter of the law, and oftentimes they would slap them with lawsuits if they weren't. Unfortunately, there were not a team of lawyers canvassing Cumberland County, so it was a lot more difficult. But there was actually a case where an enslaved woman sued her enslaver in Carlisle, and it got all the way to the state Supreme Court. And she actually had the law right. However, the state Supreme Court ruled against her. They actually got the law wrong. I mean, any lawyer could look at that and see. So it was possible, but like you're saying, it was an uphill battle for sure. And far away from Philadelphia and the kind of the hub of abolitionism, it was a very steep hill to climb.
I imagine it would be the way it is today. The better lawyer you have, the more resources you have, the better your chances.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of these abolitionist lawyers, it's a great point. You know, a lot of them are, in many ways, they're working pro bono. And there's a lot of tension between abolitionist lawyers who might want to make a point by making a certain legal argument, whereas there are enslaved people who are literally fighting for their freedom. And there are cases where sometimes anti-slavery lawyers would make not the best argument to win the case, but an argument they thought would play well politically. And oftentimes, you know, the enslaved person who is suing for their freedom gets left in the lurch. But yeah, certainly. And the other factor to keep in mind is that, you know, in places like Cumberland County, most of the county officials are slaveholders themselves. So they're, you know, they're the ones who have access to the documents. So they're not exactly going to be apt to sympathize with people who are suing for their freedom, because they might think, well, the people that they're enslaving might do the same thing. I believe you had a question yet?
Well, have more of a comment. We lived in the house that Francis Campbell built, the one who protested against, he had 6 slaves when he died in 1790. And they
in Shippensburg, this is?
Yes. And they sold the parents and willed the children, there were 2 children, to members of the family in his will. And from there until the Civil War, the owners at that time were part of the Underground Railroad, because there's a very large cave on the property. And we knew the grandchildren of the owner during the Civil War, who heard their aunt tell stories about taking food to the slaves in the cave. And I don't know that they ever said how long that went on, but there also was a slave who was sent up from Baltimore, and the owner of Francis Campbell's house during the Civil War gave him a piece of land and helped him until he was no longer able. And then there was another man who lived at the entrance of the college now, who helped that man. So we've always
That's
been
fascinating.
Yeah.
What was the name of the gentleman who owned the property during the Civil War? Do you recall?
Yes, White, Charles White.
Okay.
He
Do you know
was-
what religion he was?
Yes, he was, both men, Campbell and White, were members of Middle Spring Presbyterian Church. It's a historic little church in Middle Spring.
So the guy that built the house was a slave owner, and the guy there during the Civil War was an abolitionist and helped people escape. And they did a television program recently. They came to our house and did a television program
On the Travel Channel.
on the Travel Channel about that story. We got to tell them the story, and we met in our house and told them the story, and they took it. Then we went across the meadow, and they went into the cave, and they took pictures in the cave, and had a little mock-up where they had somebody
Dramatized.
dramatized thing where a little kid came to the cave with a basket full of food. And I wondered if they had the play act. I'm sure. I think the daughters were 12 years old when they were taking that food. They probably had the play act to be sure that the kids knew what to tell the neighbors if they saw them taking food, you know, that they were going on a picnic. They didn't probably want to let them know they were helping slaves, because I'm sure there were people in Shippensburg that were on both sides of the issue.
That's fascinating. Yeah, there were a lot of slave catchers in Shippensburg. In fact, in Leesburg, little town was like 5 miles east of Shippensburg. There was a brother. There were two brothers who, one of whom was known for being anti-slavery in politics. The other was a slave catcher. Essentially operating as for hire. So yeah, there was a lot of divide. Certainly, there were more slave catchers in Franklin County than anywhere else in Pennsylvania, but they didn't necessarily operate with free license. I mean, they were certainly a threat, but more slave catchers than abolitionists would be convicted under Pennsylvania law, which is a surprising fact, but it's a testament to the success that Underground Railroad activists aren't just breaking the law; they're also pushing for laws that are more favorable and that are coming down harder on slave catchers.
You said that the Dobbin House in Gettysburg, I live in Franklin County, had that same distinction. The owner was a slave owner and the son was an abolitionist. Isn't that what you had said earlier?
That's a great point. Yeah, it's a similar family dynamic of, I assume, because Campbell he would have been, I don't know, what year did he build the house?
We're not sure, but
Okay.
Think about 1750.
mid 17. He
Okay.
came in 1730 to Shippensburg with Edward Shipper.
Very early, yeah. But
Researched the Philosophical Society. There was a correspondence there, and looking for some mention of building his plantation. That's about a mile out of town, but there wasn't. We haven't been able to pin down the time he actually built his. He lived on the main street and had a store there at first.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar time. I mean, Dobbin built his house in the 1776, which is easy to remember. But so it's a little bit later. But yeah, it's the same generational dynamic where the father and the son. Now, notably, part of the reason why people think the Dobbin House itself was part of the Underground Railroad is because we know about his son named Matthew Dobbin, who became an abolitionist. But again, the important thing is Matthew Dobbin went broke, lost the house in bankruptcy court. So the house was out of the Dobbin family by the Civil War. And then Matthew Dobbin moved to Franklin County, where he was a live-in school teacher because he didn't have any money. And that's where he becomes an active abolitionist and involved in the Underground Railroad. So it is a Dobbin, but it's a Dobbin who's broken in a different county.
Well, being from Franklin County, the number one question is, was the old jail really used as a part of, because they promote that for tourism and that's cool with me. It's not, but I'm wondering how truthful that might be. The other thing is we have a lot of neighbors who are Mennonite and Amish. What was their connection with the abolitionist or slavery or whatever?
A great question. So on the old jail, I have never found any direct evidence. And this is one of the things that makes Underground Railroad research tricky is it's almost better. Our best records are court records when somebody gets caught, but very few abolitionists got caught. So the couple times they do, like in 1847 in Carlisle, we can document things with great detail, but most of the time we're relying on records that come in the 1890s, after 40 years of haze and, memories getting fuzzier, or people just making things up entirely because they want to be famous and they want to be part of the Underground Railroad retrospectively. But no, I haven't found anything on the old jail. To your second question about Mennonite and Amish, there would be some interesting work about the Mennonite community. I believe they were more inclined to be anti-slavery, but they didn't take quite the active role as Quakers. There was a lot of, Rick might know more about this too. There was a split within the Quaker community itself between certain Quakers who I think tended to be more towards the Mennonite view that they should oppose slavery, but do so privately, that they didn't need to go publicly campaigning against it. And there was another faction of the Quakers. This split happens in the 1820s that no, we need to aggressively campaign to end slavery. My impression is that there's a similar split within the Mennonites, but I just don't know enough to be able to give you an answer. But in terms of Franklin County, the leading anti-slavery activists, there's a community in Quincy in the southeastern corner of the state. There's also a community in Chambersburg itself, led by, is it Henry Watson? I believe that's the name. I have to double check. He's a black barber in Chambersburg, and he's actually the person when Frederick Douglass comes to town to meet John Brown before his abortive raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Henry Watson is the guy who greets Frederick Douglass at the train station and helps conduct him to the secret meeting location. But perhaps, Rick, I don't know if you're aware of any more about the Mennonite story.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, you're correct. It was Henry Watson, and he was a barber in Chambersburg. And again, the one thing that we were talking about, the slave catchers, the impression is that the slave catchers would actually not really take the captured slaves down south. A lot of times they went down to like Hagerstown, Sharpsburg, where there were slave auctions there. So again, they were just in it for the money, and they had to catch and get rid of them as quick as possible. But just like Cooper said, there's so much myth surrounding the Underground Railroad. Certainly, there's supposed to be a place in Waynesboro, I believe, that was a hiding place. It was like a little cave-ish kind of place somewhere up on in the I think it's in the eastern end of town. But I've had a hard time confirming or denying that is true as well.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much for turning out. I know it's a lovely Saturday afternoon, so I appreciate you spending your time here. Feel free to follow up with any other questions, and it's good to see everyone.
Yes, thank you very much. And of course, if you haven't had a chance to go out and get his book, we're gonna sell it too. Let's see, there you go. And like I say, it's been a real pleasure. I always learn something from these talks, and again, it's always great to have the ability to host these talks, and hopefully we'll be able to invite Cooper back in another time. All right. So everybody have a great day, enjoy Saturday, and thank you very much.